Hi Pine Class, it's Wednesday afternoon and for story time we will be continuing with chapter 7. I will not pretend I wasn't petrified. I was. But mixed in with the awful fear was a glorious feeling of excitement. Most of the really exciting things we do in our lives scare us to death. They wouldn't be exciting if they didn't. I sat very stiff and upright in my seat, gripping the steering wheel tight with both hands. My eyes were about level with the top of the steering wheel. I could have done with a cushion to raise me higher, but it was too late for that. The road seemed awfully narrow in the dark. I knew there was room enough for 2 cars to pass each other. I'd seen them from the filling station doing it 1,000,000 times, but it didn't look that way to me from where I was. At any moment, something with blazing headlamps might come roaring towards me at 60 miles an hour, a heavy lorry or one of those big long-distance buses that travel through the night full of passengers. Was I too much in the middle of the road? Yes, I was. But I didn't want to pull in closer for fear of hitting the bank. If I hit the bank and burst the front axle, then all would be lost, and I'd never get my father home. The motor was beginning to rattle and shake. I was still in first gear. It was vital to change up into second, otherwise the engine would get too hot. I knew how the change was done, but I'd never actually tried doing it. Around the filling station, I'd always stayed in first gear. Well, here goes. I eased my foot off the accelerator. I pressed the clutch down and held it there. I found the gear lever and pulled it straight back from first into second. I released the clutch and pressed on the accelerator. The little car leapt forward as though it had been stung. We were in second gear. What speed were we going? I glanced at the speedometer. It was lit up very faintly, but I was able to read it. It said 15 miles an hour. Good. That was quite fast enough. I would stay in second gear. I started figuring out how long it would take me to do 6 miles travelling at 15 miles an hour. At 60 miles an hour, 6 miles would take 6 minutes. At 30, it would take twice as long, 12 minutes. At 15, it would take twice as long again, 24 minutes. I kept going. I knew every bit of the road, every curve and every little rise and dip. Once a fox flashed out in front of the hedge and ran across the road with his long bushy tail streaming out behind him. I saw him clearly in the glow of my headlamps. His fur was red-brown and he had a white muzzle. It was a thrilling sight. I began to worry about the motor. I knew very well it would be certain to overheat if I drove for long in either first or second gear. I was in second. I must now change up into third. I took a deep breath and grasped the gear lever again. Foot off the accelerator. Clutch in. Gear lever up and across and up again. Clutch out. I'd done it. I pressed down on the accelerator. The speedometer crept up to 30. I gripped the wheel very tight with both hands and stayed in the middle of the road. At this rate, I would soon be there. Hazel's Wood was not on the main road. To reach it, you had to turn left through a gap in the hedge and go uphill over a bumpy track for about 1/4 of a mile. If the ground had been wet, there would have been no hope of getting there in the car. But there hadn't been any rain for a week, and the ground would surely be hard and dry. I figured I must be getting pretty close to the turning place now. I must watch out for it carefully. It would be easy to miss it. There was no gate or anything else to indicate where it was. It was simply a small gap in the hedge, just wide enough to allow farm tractors to go through. Suddenly, far ahead of me, just below the rim of the night sky, I saw a splash of yellow light. I watched it trembling. This was something I'd been dreading all along. Very quickly, the light got brighter and brighter and nearer, and in a few seconds it took shape and became the long white beam of headlamps from a car rushing towards me. My turning place must be close now. I was desperate to reach it and swing off the road before that monster reached me. I pressed my foot down hard for more speed. The little engine roared. The speedometer needle went from 30 to 35 and then to 40, but the other car was closing fast. Its headlamps were like two dazzling white eyes. They grew bigger and bigger, and suddenly the whole road in front of me was lit up as clear as daylight. And swish! The thing went past me like a bullet. It was so close I felt the wind of it through my open window. And in that tiny fraction of a second, when the two of us were alongside one another, I caught a glimpse of its white-painted body, and I knew it was the police. I didn't dare look round to see if they were stopping and coming back after me. I was certain they would stop. Any policeman in the world would stop if he suddenly passed a small boy in a tiny car chugging along a lonely road at 2:30 in the morning. My only thought was to get away, to escape, to vanish, though heaven knows how I was going to do that. I pressed my foot harder still on the accelerator. Then all at once I saw in my own dim headlamps the tiny gap in the hedge on my left-hand side. There wasn't any time to brake or slow down, so I just yanked the wheel hard over and prayed. The little car swerved violently off the road, leaping through the gap, hitting the rising ground and bouncing high in the air, then skidded round sideways behind the hedge and stopped. The first thing I did was to switch off all my lights. I'm not quite sure what made me do this, except that I knew I must hide, and I knew that if you're hiding from someone in the dark, you don't shine lights all over the place to show where you are. I sat very still in my dark car. The hedge was a thick one, and I couldn't see through it. The car had bounced and skidded sideways in such a way that it was now right off the track. It was behind the hedge and in a sort of field. It was facing back towards the filling station and tucked in very close to the hedge. I could hear the police car. It had pulled up about 50 yards down the road, and now it was backing and turning. The road was far too narrow for it to turn around in one go. Then the roar from the motor got louder, and he came back fast with engine revving and headlights blazing. He flashed past the place I was hiding and raced away into the night. That meant the policeman had not seen me swing off the road. But he was certain to come back again, looking for me. And if he came back slowly enough, he'd probably see the gap. He would stop and get out of his car. He'd walk right through the gap and look behind the hedge, and then his torch would shine in my face and he'd say, "What's going on, Sonny? What's the big idea? Where do you think you're going? And whose car is this? Where do you live? Where are your parents?" He would make me go with him to the police station, and in the end they'd get the whole story out of me, and my father would be ruined. I sat as quiet as a mouse and waited. I waited for a long time. Then I heard the sound of the motor coming back again in my direction. It was making a terrific noise. He was going flat out. He whizzed past me like a rocket. The way he was gunning that motor told me he was a very angry man. He must have been a very puzzled man too. Perhaps he was thinking he'd seen a ghost boy driving a ghost car. I waited to see if he'd come back again. He didn't come. I switched on my lights. I pressed the starter. She started at once. But what about the wheels and the chassis? I felt sure something must have got broken when she jumped off the road onto the cart track. I put her into gear and very gently began to ease her forward. I listened carefully for horrid noises. There were none. I managed to get her off the grass and back onto the track. I drove very slowly now. The track was extremely rough and rutted, and the slope was pretty steep. The little car bounced and bumped all over the place, but she kept going. Then at last, ahead of me, and over to the right, looking like some kind of gigantic black creature crouching on the crest of the hill, I saw Hazel's Wood. Soon I was there. Immense trees rose up towards the sky all along the right-hand side of the track. I stopped the car. I got out, taking the torch with me. There was the usual hedge dividing the wood from the track. I squeezed my way through it, and suddenly I was in the wood. When I looked up, the trees had closed above my head like a prison roof, and I couldn't see the smallest patch of sky or a single star. I couldn't see anything at all. The darkness was so solid around me I could almost touch it. "Dad?" I called out. "Dad, are you there?" My small, high voice echoed through the forest and faded away. I listened for an answer, but none came. And that's the end of chapter 7.